Welcome to your first online lesson. Today we're going to review the scientific method. You may have heard of this in other science classes, but your teacher might have called it the scientific cycle or the scientific process. Regardless of what you called it, the scientific method is a way that scientists do experiments that make sure that we remove bias from our labs and make sure that we're only testing one variable at a time. And well, not just goofing off in the laboratory. So, if you're ready, let's get experimenting. Before we start the actual sciencing, we need to make sure that we protect ourselves. It's only in the comic books that the scientists get those crazy superpowers. In real life, not following our lab safety procedures can lead to pain, injury, or even worse, a failing grade. So let's get started. First off, goggles. The human eye is a really important organ, and we don't want them to get burned or poked out of our skulls. So please wear goggles at all times during an experiment. Next, our hands. We don't want to contaminate the sample, nor do we want the sample to contaminate us. So we need to make sure that we are wearing gloves. Now, for those of you with short hair, this next rule, don't worry about it. But for those of us with the long, very flammable hair, we need to make sure we tie it back. Much better. Finally, our feet. This is for everybody. Please wear closed-toed shoes on lab days. This protects your feet from the chemicals, the sharp objects, and especially the clumsy lab partners. So now that we're safe from most danger, let's get started with the actual experiment. So as you'll see this year in class, the best way to learn science is to actually do science. So today, as I review the scientific method, I'm going to actually do an experiment. So feel free to do this experiment with me at home. You can see the basic materials that you need here, but you don't have to. You can just watch the video if you'd like. Now, the very first step of the scientific method is to make an observation. A scientific observation is something that you can either see, hear, touch, smell, or taste. Probably not taste though, but those are going to be our 5 senses. Then we make a question based on our observations. Now we all know the toddler that says, but why? But why? But why? That's not a scientific question. Scientific questions are straightforward problems that can be answered with just one experiment. And based on my observations here, candy, water, some beakers, I could come up with a variety of questions. Like, does candy dissolve? Which candy tastes the best? Does all candy float? Or what's the volume of each candy bar? But we can only answer one question at a time. Oh man, I was hoping for the taste test. Oh well, here we go. Which candy will float? Now, every question has an answer, and sometimes we can't find that answer on Google, or we just don't want to. So we make a guesstimate, or scientifically, a hypothesis. Now, in an experiment like this one, we want to make a hypothesis for each one of the independent variables. The independent variable is what I have control of changing, or if you're doing the experiment, which you have control of changing. So we're going to make a different hypothesis for each one of our independent variables. I'm going to hypothesize that the Twix is going to sink, that the Snickers is going to also sink, that the Three Musketeers, I think it'll float. I think the Milky Way will float too. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say that this Milky Way Midnight, it's going to sink. Remember, it's okay if I'm incorrect. That's part of the scientific method. So before we actually start doing the experiment, we want to make sure we write down our steps. This is called a scientific procedure. Now, a procedure is really important so that other scientists can repeat our work. We want to make sure that all scientists stay honest. We don't want one scientist saying they did something and actually doing something completely different. So today, you'll see our procedure show up on the side here. Now, step 1 of this procedure is to pour about 150 milliliters of water into each beaker, which I will do right now. Right. Now you'll notice I poured the exact same amount of water into each beaker. This is called a constant. we want to keep many variables in the experiment the same. Other example of constants might be the temperature of the water, the size of the beakers, the actual size of the candy bars, and the time that the candy bars are left in the water. Basically, anything that could affect our independent and dependent variable. So step 2, we want to make sure we have something to compare our experiments to. This way we can rule out anything crazy, like this is special water that makes everything float. To do this, we use a control variable. See, normally the control variable is the opposite of the independent variable. So if I was testing fertilizer, I would use some plants with fertilizer and some with no fertilizer, and the no fertilizer would be the control. In this case, since we're using candy, the opposite of candy is a rock. So, step 3, I'm now going to test each independent variable to observe the dependent variable. The dependent variable, like I said, is what we observe during the experiment, and it's affected by the independent variable. In this case, the dependent variable is if the candy is going to sink or float. So first off, we're going to test our control, and it's obviously going to sink. Next, we're going to test each candy. We'll see that the Twix sinks, the Snickers also sinks, the Three Musketeers, it floats. The Milky Way, it sinks, and the Milky Way Midnight also sinks. Now step 4 happens at the same time as step 3, and that's that we record our results into a chart. Now we want to note a few things here. First of all, this is a chart, not a graph. A chart is a table that's used to record our data, and a graph is used to display that data visually, like a pie graph or a bar graph. Next, we want to notice that my hypothesis was not always correct, and that's okay. Actually, it's awesome, because it means I learned something new and I didn't just prove myself correct. Now, for my favorite part. Why? We know that some candy floats and others don't. But why? Why does this happen? What's going on? It has to do with density. Candy like the Snickers, the Twix, the Milky Ways, they're filled with peanuts and caramel, and they're more dense than water, so they sink. Candy like the Three Musketeers, well, it's mostly air, so it floats because it's less dense than water. This final step or explanation is called a conclusion. It basically goes through and explains our results. Now you might be thinking, I wonder if Sour Patches would float, or Twizzlers. What about marshmallows? What about not even candy? Do hot fries float? What about Funyuns? All great questions. And this is the final step of scientific knowledge, asking new questions based on the results and conclusions of the original test. If we didn't do this, we'd still be using a typewriter instead of cell phones. And this is why we call it the scientific cycle. We start with a question, and we end with more questions. Isn't it amazing? Now that you're done, it's time for the quiz. Watch the video again if you need to. You only have 2 chances to take the quiz, and you can watch the video again in between those 2 chances. So, the access code is superpowers, all one word and lowercase. And it's that code because I think you're all super. Good luck, guys.